Hey everybody, it's Michael from the Watch Preserve, and I'm here today with Kevin from Box and Papers and our owner Nick. And we're gonna get into the weeds, debate style, on the various values of vintage versus the modern market. Kevin deals a lot of modern watches. We obviously do a lot of vintage. So we figured it'd be cool to get the two of us, or three of us, here and kind of get into it, guys. So, first question I think that probably a lot of people would want to know is if you're getting into watches, if you're a new watch buyer, should you look at vintage or should you look at modern?
Do you want to start or you want me to start?
Go ahead.
Yeah. So I think in terms of like price point, it's going to be a big difference on that for me. I like to use Omega. Um, Modern Omega and pre-owned, you're looking at minimum 3K on the very, very low end twos. You can pick up a great Seamaster for 500. You can pick up even some other stuff for a couple $100 in the vintage side of it. Probably keeping time properly, and it doesn't even need anything. So um, I think just justification also in terms of modern is it's like a commodity you're buying pretty much instead of buying a piece of horology and a high quality timepiece that did have some aspect of hand finishing still integrated into it. So
I agree to some of that. I think design wise, a lot of modern watch companies has kind of lost a lot. Like when you say commodity, I get what you mean. It's pretty much
That's fine.
it's just like Coca-Cola coming out with a new flavor, right? A new wrapping, it's the same watch. And they look at it as a completely new product. But I think there is also merit to a modern watch. One is that vintage. It takes a lot of education to know what you're getting. There's a lot of fakes, shady Frankensteins out there. Um, Secondly, maintenance. With new watches, it's very hassle free, at least from my experience. All the modern movements are quite reliable. And when you speak movements, I think they have made pretty significant improvements over the years. Maybe not in the finishing aspect, but as far as power reserve, robustness, um, you talk about shock resistance, anti magnetism. I think they made a lot of improvements over the years. So especially for your first watch, if you don't want to spend 3K on a pre-owned Omega, you can always go for Hamilton or a Seiko, right? I do agree that you can get a higher, more prestige brand in vintage for less money. Um, but I think it depends on the buyer.
I want to touch on something that both of you kind of said, and it's like, you can buying secondary with vintage, that there might be Frankenstein watch or something like that out there. But argue the same could be true buying pre-owned for modern watches. Oftentimes a lot of these big brands have super clones, have super fakes, and so that's for buyer peace of mind. Is there more peace of mind going to an authorized dealer, paying a little bit more to get that watch if that's your concern, or is it still the better value option to go for pre-owned and vintage or modern? That's where the dealer comes in, right?
I think from a long-term perspective, you were talking about movement quality and stuff like that. The big issue, in my opinion, on new is that the brands are trying to take complete control of their service capacity. So they sell you an expensive watch and then they force you to do an expensive service on their terms. They basically send it to Switzerland and they do it locally, but it's like their terms, start to finish, and they're, in my opinion, delivering a high level of quality servicing wise, but they're not really having the customer in mind. I think they're trying to squeeze additional money out of the customer after the fact. Whereas with vintage, you have a lot more options and a lot more real watchmaking that can be done on the pieces.
That is true. I mean, I think you can draw the parallel to like cars. With modern cars, you can't. There's all electronics, right?
You can't work on it yourself.
Yeah, not a lot of people can work on themselves, but it is a better car, right? Even though it might not look better than vintage cars, but yeah, the ride is better, the technology is better. I think it's the same thing with modern watches. I think Omega probably spent $100 million developing that fully integrated coaxial movement. It's a fantastic movement. I think it's one of the best you can get under 10 grand.
Yeah.
And it's true that not everybody can service it. You require special tools, special parts.
You wouldn't want them to either. I can admit that. I mean, you don't
Yeah.
want some stranger of the street
right.
touching your
So
coaxial.
yeah.
It's just the aspect of I think they almost in a sense hold back ownership of the piece because they're forcing you to do it their way, even though you own the piece itself. You own it,
Yeah.
but in a sense you don't.
Yeah, I mean, there's
That's-
definitely an economic incentive.
Yeah.
Right.
And whereas vintage, you own kind of like the whole history of the watch. If it patinaed nicely, you got some beautiful aspect to it. You own kind of all of that, and you own history. Whereas modern, it's like I mentioned kind of in the beginning, it's a commodity, pure commoditization of the watch industry. The only caveat to this, and we talked a little bit about this yesterday, independence, very, very expensive independence, Voutilainen's, lots of other ones. I mean, like the ones where you're talking about 50K plus wait list. There's a reason they get this and they achieve this.
Mm-hmm.
It's because their level of quality is just next level, and it's not a commodity. It's still a piece of art.
What do you think, like, when you say real watchmaking, what do you think that's so hard nowadays? What's so inaccessible for, you can't even get something good for under 10 anymore, right?
In modern perspective, I mean, it depends on what you consider good. So
Well, it's
having the same level of quality as a Hamilton from the 50s, 60s, especially when it was still USA made stuff. Modern Omega is nice too, just more commoditized. Getting that level of quality from that in comparison, yeah, you're talking crazy nuts because this was hand finishing prolage done on it. Somebody was QCing every aspect of the movement, including under the bridges, including under the dial. Whereas now people realize, especially with open case backs, the brands realize that's the most important aspect. Let's make that look great. It's perfect. Not everything is perfect sometimes, including especially where it can be seen. So
I do agree with that. A lot of modern watches, you put it under a microscope, you really scrutinize the details. You can see a lot of uniformity.
yeah,
Like spillage on the loom, where the finishing is jagged. Stuff like you said, stuff that you don't see on face value, but underneath the hands, for example, or like on the side of the movement, I do see that. And like you said, it's what happens when these big corporations get behind these old prestige brands, and it's more about profit.
Profit and production. I mean, you're not going to make millions of watches a year without a CNC machine putting stuff out, especially when you talk about salaries in Switzerland, 6 figures minimum normally for watchmakers. I mean, what can you do? There's also a shortage of watchmakers, and that's causing, I think, the other aspect of how do you hand finish stuff when you can't get people, and when you want it hand finished, you have to charge an absurd price. I mean, like Voutilainen's are my best example. You can't buy one, like especially a normal person, but it's just perfection and art combined, and design quality, and it's just.
Do you think the price is justified what they're charging?
It's art. There is no price with art.
I do agree because
it pretty much they charge what they want.
Yeah, because there's only a handful of people that can do that.
Yeah,
right.
That would do it.
Yeah,
I mean that guy took a huge shot in the beginning. Independent watchmaking wasn't a big thing. I've heard from people telling me stories that know him. He was at Bosworld setting in a booth on his own in the beginning, selling watches on his own. So he took a big shot, but he never slacked on quality. You look at his early stuff to the stuff now, same quality, high quality as it gets. So.
So if it's not, I mean, the majority of watch buyers are not buying lines, right? The majority of, especially new watch buyers, want to buy things like, what's just that? The majority of watch buyers want to get, an Omega or a Rolex or a Tag Heuer, or maybe if they want to get into vintage, they want to get a Bulova or a military Hamilton, right? Like those are totally different financial worlds as opposed to Voutilainen. And I think you guys were touching on something interesting, talking about buying the history of the watch or history of the brand. And if you're buying a modern Omega, you're still buying into that history But I guess from a design point, do you feel now that so many of these brands are reviving like vintage designs and vintage models? Are we starting to kind of get to a point of diminishing returns with vintage inspired pieces on the modern market? Or are you seeing from vintage that a lot of brands are lacking innovation in their design language nowadays?
Yeah, certainly.
I think on the modern aspect, you probably would know more on that.
I think there's a lot of modern brands that are not doing right anymore in the design department. They're just kind of capturing whatever the newest trend, which I don't blame them because the biggest segment buyer right now is Gen Z.
Really? Gen Z?
Yeah. Oh. We can talk about it later, but a recent report came out from Watchfinder with some very fascinating numbers. But yeah, so they kind of have to follow where the money is. And Gen Z is kind of about, showing off and being flashy. So you're definitely going to see designs skewing that way. But I think...
Do you think it's switching more to like the fashion aspect then versus high horology like it kind of started in the beginning?
I think the priorities have changed, right? It's first it's about status. Then it still has to be a good watch underneath, but primarily they want, like, if I buy this watch, I go outside, I want to be noticed. I think that's the biggest driving factor. Plus, social media is not helping. Where they're kind of all pushing the same watch. You see all those dealers in New York, Submariners, Royal Oak.
That's been that way for a long time. That's not just a recent thing.
Yeah, but I mean, a lot of modern watch companies, I think they kind of lost their soul. But there are a few exceptions I think are still doing, passionate true watchmaking, even though they're, it's modern manufacturing process.
What would be a brand?
I think Grand Seiko is up there. Personally, I like Parmigiani with their new line. Blancpain also, I think, is very true to their roots.
You're not bothered by the swatch collaboration?
I am very bothered by that, but I still
other podcast.
I still like their products.
Is it design in general or quality, or what are you saying that makes you want to hold, for example, Blancpain still highly up?
I think the design language hasn't really deviated from their original DNA. They're not. I think IWC can be bundled into that category. Like, they're always kind of just doing what they think is good. They're not kind of really listening to what the market wants. And Grand Seiko, they're still very much putting a lot of investment into movement manufacturing and fabrication technologies. Like they use what's it called? Pretty much semiconductor production method to make their parts, where the variance on part is like nanometers. So I think, in terms of quality control, that's could be a positive for modern watches.
That's as good as it gets. Yeah.
Right.
So, using modern technology to improve horology is one aspect of modern that I have to say is great. I think if it's done appropriately, making a watch so that a tennis player can swing quickly.
I do want to ask you about your thoughts on Richard Mille.
I'm not commenting directly on the brand, but I think making different innovations in horology is cool. Yeah, that's kind of the whole focus of what they should be doing, in my opinion, creating new innovations. But doing it for commercial purposes and for marketing purposes, in my opinion, is not. It shouldn't be the focus. It should be how do we, like you mentioned with Seiko, I do like that. Figuring out how we get the finish even more perfect, with the engineering of parts down to the nanometer, so that there's everything is spot on.
Right. So who's doing it right then? Like, who's innovating, right? Apart from Grand Seiko, and you're not allowed to say Budalainen in this sentence. So who's innovating? And this may be a question more for Kevin, but Nick, of course, who's doing the innovation? Who is, whether it's an independent or a larger company, who's using that modern technology to really come out with new advances in horology?
Aside from Grand Seiko, I think Zenith is really pushing the envelope. They're very daring when it comes to new movement architecture. I'm not too big of a fan on their modern designs, but movement side, I think they're doing some amazing.
What aspect are you not a fan of?
They're too big,
I agree.
too tall.
Not for a normal kind of wrist size, and not really like something you just wear out without thinking about it, because it's kind of
and they're coming out with these like green Aaron Rodgers limited editions. I mean, it's like that's just a cash grab, you know.
Now we're gonna go into another thing with the limited editions that I cannot stand about modern watches.
Yeah, so Omega coming out with a limited edition, Grand Seiko coming out with a limited edition every other week. It seems,
That's the thing. That's a whole different department, right? You can't blame the watchmakers because they have no control over kind of that side of the business.
Yeah, they get told, make us another dial, and they say, okay.
So, maybe you should have a watchmaker in charge of the company and not a salesperson.
Sure, but what companies would nobody would sell any wine?
I've seen watchmakers run companies before, and I'm technically a watchmaker, so I don't know if I should put myself down also, but that normally doesn't turn out too well. Yeah. Watchmakers have kind of just a general different mindset on how things go. It's so much of a focus on like the piece itself and what's coming out, and the commercial aspect kind of just disappears. They don't really know how to run a business. So that's generally what I've seen as a problem. It's great in theory. I wish there would be some way that they could somehow take limited editions and make true limited editions where they, for example, you take a watch like this Yema I have right here. It's got like the Formica, so it's made to look like a a racing dashboard. Do a limited edition.
That's a more modern brand, right? That's
70s. That's
70s?
the original. So
okay.
They have revamped the brand, new brand, different company in a sense. I guess it's still the same brand, same company, but they went out of business and then got back in business.
Okay.
So kind of not the same company. The cool aspect that they could do with something like that, especially owning the brand, is they could reissue that once and just stop. Like, we have the design, we've had it before, we want to reissue this design, do it once, stop. Don't do another one that looks almost exactly the same. Another one looks exactly the same. It's all limited editions, but it's the same thing.
Yeah.
That's my big problem with it.
The problem with that is that once you sell out on your first issue, they're like, oh, everybody wants this.
Yep.
The incentive is there, so let's make a second round, a third round, fourth round.
I was going to use the example. I have to mention Doxa every time I'm on camera, apparently. But Doxa was a brand similar to Yema. They disappeared essentially shortly after the quartz crisis from company mismanagement or what have you, and then they were revived in the early 2000s. But then under the recent ownership, they introduced a reissue of the Doxa Army, which was one of those watches that was so rare that people weren't even sure if it was real. They had maybe seen one or two examples, and they did a reissue of that, sold out in minutes. I think it was distributed. There was like another exclusive version through Watches of Switzerland and a limited edition. And then very shortly after that, they introduced a kind of a non-limited version that's not in the PVD coating, and you can get one in green or whatever. And that's, like you said, Kevin, like it's difficult, I think, for brands, especially brands that aren't huge, to do limited editions because they see the momentum that it builds them. And I think it's difficult always to have, unique designs when it's very easy to sacrifice uniqueness for profits.
Yeah.
But as a business, you have to make money.
Yeah. And Grand Seiko is suffering from that tremendously.
Yeah.
Their limited editions used to be very special.
So special, like the Whirlpool, Peacock, those things. Yeah.
They were perfect, and then they saw the incentive there, and all they do now is limited editions.
Yeah.
And they lost that specialness. But the watches are still nice.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Still nice, but not that insider kind of track that they used to be. Grand Seiko was very much for a long time still very small niche in the collecting community.
Because when your goal is shifted from making the best watch versus having the same revenue as Omega, stuff changes.
Yeah,
sure. This might be a question for you, Nick. So I'm thinking about like the differences now. Obviously watch companies are producing more volume probably than ever before in watchmaking history. But you have brands like Bulova that in the 50s and 60s were the largest watch producers in the world. They were producing millions of watches a year. but the quality for vintage Bulova is still quite good compared to other watches of the day and maybe even some stuff now. So from your point of view as a watchmaker who sees all the little bits and bobs that we might not always notice or see, like how is it possible for brands to implement other things to try to keep up with that level of quality with the production size needed nowadays? Or is it, totally a thing of the past that watches have that kind of human final touch at the end of QC or whatever?
I think it's a business decision at that point. I think and I had a guy come in that actually came in and bought an Omega from us, and he's a business owner also, and he kind of talked about, as a business owner, you get to like a certain level and you have to decide, are you going to make the next step and do all that investment? And at that point, if you want to make the next jump, it has to become more of a commercial thought versus like, what is your product and what are you actually showing to the world and what's the world getting from you?
Right.
And I think, unfortunately, a lot of these companies are so big that they have to always side on that commercial aspect. Personally, I'm hoping that I can stay at that sweet spot where I still get to have the passion of displaying watches and interacting with watches and dealing with people on watches directly, but be big enough that I can not always have the stress of like feeling like there's a boulder on my back that I'm just getting whipped while I'm carrying it down the street. So you probably understand the same thing.
Yeah.
Not complaining because this is awesome what we get to do, but
the best part about it is meeting the people, right?
It's all about it.
It's all about
you. I opened this store 100% just for customer interaction. I could have stayed online forever.
Yeah.
I would have been perfectly fine. I would have had a fine life. I wouldn't have been driving a Ferrari like a lot of watch dealers on the hype side that show that they're living the baller life. I don't believe in that. I drive a Prius. So I think if you're honest with yourself and you really go in the direction you feel is right for you, then you're going to have a good product and you're going to be able to have that kind of passion behind the pieces. The companies we're talking about are just too good.
Yeah.
I think that's why the independents do such a great job.
Yeah.
Like, especially at a certain price point, they just do an incredible job. It's because they're like a small team and they're actually interacting still with customers on an occasional basis, and like they see the artistic aspect going together with the commercial where they can still grow, but they realize like we don't want to make 1 million pieces. We don't need to.
Right.
At the price point, and we can put out that product, like that dream product. So
yeah, that's so hard to do.
I didn't mention it,
You didn't. Good job.
Yeah.
So
did that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, man. I think so. It's priorities for the business, and that's where the independents can really excel.
Just make sure I'm recording. Okay, we're good.
Good. We're enthusiasts, not professionals.
Yeah.
So I think we need to talk about. We're talking about independence. We're talking about high-end watchmaking.
Mm-hmm.
Kevin recently showed Nick a watch that he thinks is sort of a pinnacle of watchmaking, in-house movement, micro rotor, and everything like that. What was the watch again, Kevin?
This one?
No, the one that you showed us yesterday, and Nick's not convinced it's a totally in-house movement.
Oh, I was talking about the Chopard Luke 1860.
Okay, tell us about that watch.
So you can probably put a picture of.
Yeah, we'll put something up.
It's my favorite watch that's came out in recent years. Gorgeous dial, gorgeous case, gorgeous movement.
Mm-hmm.
I talked about they use the same dial maker from Philip IV, and they claim to have in-house movement with micro rotor, and their in-house steel.
Mm-hmm.
Which a lot of other brands have,
sure,
to kind of stand out from the pack.
So this is not an inexpensive watch.
No, it's $23,000 if you're lucky. It's
sure.
Very limited. But what we debated about was how brands are now using the word in-house and what it really means.
What it actually means and what movement originality means. Because Nick came in today and through his watchmaking research and knowledge, says that this watch is the movement is essentially a copy of an older Universal Genève movement.
Design language.
Design language. Okay.
That was inspired.
Very,
Inspired.
That was a
and it
derivative.
looks really
Sure.
remote. Let's
Yeah.
just put it that way.
But
I
we've
don't
been
want Shepard coming after me. I'm just going to say looks a little similar to me.
similar.
But
people
this
have-
is very common in the watch world.
I was going to say, I mean, people have
Yeah.
been making watches, especially, intricately finished movements and case styles for years now. And there can only be so many ways to get a movement to work, right?
Mhm.
So where's the line of originality versus inspiration? And what does it mean to truly make a movement in-house? I mean, I'm sure a lot of watchmakers are all sourcing screws and components and all those little things that
Right.
you don't want to waste time making at your manufacturer for, but
There's brands that do it.
there are brands that do it, but how many compared to the greater watchmaking world actually do?
Yeah.
What is an in-house movement in modern watchmaking?
In-house, I guess, would obviously be a different design or a different functional change to a movement, because you're not fully going to redesign something, most likely, because they're just going to take from something that already existed, in my opinion, from what I've seen. Yeah. The other aspect of in-house that I find a little bit overselling is that it is mostly machine-made stuff, so that even if it's in-house and they're using that as a selling point, it's just a movement that's swapped out when it goes to the factory. So
Yeah, that's another thing we should talk about is when you service your watch, what do they really do to it?
well, certain brands associated with Rolex but not Rolex, I'm not going to say exactly, are known to movement swap. Then you got Rich Prawn Group has a few brands that they're just movement swapping. So not real watchmaking, in my opinion. It's more technician work.
Yeah.
And I think in the real watchmaking aspect, you see a lot more vintage stuff because parts are unavailable for a lot of the higher end stuff, especially. So you're going to have to repivot watches. You're going to have to refinish parts. You're going to have to go through a chrono wheel and sit there and mess with the teeth to make sure that it runs smoothly. Like that, the real watchmaking aspect is applied almost 100% on the vintage, in my opinion.
Yeah. It's kind of sad to hear that because, when people buy a $6,000 watch, they think, I'm going to take care of it, I'm going to service it, and I'll give it to my kid.
Yep.
But then, and then you find out every time you send it in to the manufacturer, they just put a new movement in.
Yep. If it's bad enough, they will.
Yeah.
Like losing the core of the watch,
Yeah.
Because you're right, a lot of people, us as watch people who buy multiple watches are a very, very small percentage of the global watch market. And probably most watch people are, I don't know if you have any more insight to this, but I imagine, the 99% of people who buy watches are probably one-time buyers. They might go in and get a job and they'll buy their Tag Heuer or what have you, and then that's just kind of their watch that they have for a long time.
Yeah.
And especially if they're buying it as something they want to pass down, movement swaps or things like that do kind of wear away at the originality, I guess you could say, of the watch that they're hoping to buy as an heirloom piece.
It just makes me question quality again too. If something is, if so little work is put into something, or it's just completely machine made and not really QC'd at a certain level, that they are just like, oh, it's so easy to make another one, we're just gonna
that's
throw
the thing.
Throw it in there like nothing. I mean, what are they putting into this movement?
Mm-hmm.
What real human effort? And the whole reason that, in my opinion, horology and watchmaking, watches are just such a cool thing, is that humanity is inside of them. In a sense, like it really is that human aspect. Somebody wears a vintage watch, you see dents on it, you see, like that's another aspect I even go into with case polishing.
Yeah, but there's not a lot of human touch in modern watches anymore. I mean, mostly done 99.99% on machines.
Yeah.
Well, the thing is, they're doing the investment up front to make the movement make machines as efficient as possible. So, like when they put out 1,000,000 of these movements, it costs them maybe $200-300 for a movement. Versus,
I think it's less whenever you're talking about certain brands sourcing stuff from lower cost, lower production areas, lower cost production areas. Like,
well, even like we're talking about maybe some of the in-house brands.
Mm-hmm.
But the type
of in-house stuff, a good chunk of it, and I'm not naming brands specifically. a good chunk of this stuff is produced outside of Switzerland, and the Swiss law is only 60% assembly, I believe.
Yeah.
So that's kind of back to that question, like what counts as in-house? Like, I mean, you can really get into the minutia of it, and you can say, well, they're buying these screws, for the plates from somewhere else, but because most brands are sourcing screws, can you kind of overlook that, or is it like the definition of in-house totally like meaningless nowadays?
I think it's a marketing term nowadays. There's no real meaning to it unless you're talking about, those high-end independents, right?
It's all limited editions. That's what. If you want to, if you want to crunch it down into one little ball, modern watches, limited editions.
But I'm sure they're still servicing chronographs, right? They're not swapping chrono movements.
Swaps.
Really?
Yeah.
I'm
not naming brands on purpose.
I'm surprised.
Yep. Big brands too. Yep. Swaps.
I mean,
it's the commercial aspect taking over.
Yeah, if the numbers make sense, paying a watchmaker 6 hours of work to reassemble, disassemble everything versus
just
yeah.
Even from an employment perspective, there has been a gigantic jump in interest in technicians, watch technicians versus watchmakers in recent years, because they're realizing that probably to handle the capacity with the drop in watchmakers, especially in the U.S., is by focusing on only getting technicians and figuring out the machining side on the other side, the automated machine side.
Yeah.
So
it's kind of sad.
It's super sad.
another good argument.
Modern dealer. You're handling them all day. So.
But what I because a lot of modern movements have serial numbers on it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they would just swap a movement.
Yep.
With a different serial.
It's not that hard to reproduce something with the exact same serial number. They made it once, they can make it twice. It's the same exact movement. All it is, the same thing doing the serial number is the making every part. It's a machine.
Yeah.
Programming. Put that serial number in, it's cut. Done. Laser cut or
maybe you can tell me who those companies are off camera.
Yes.
And then we can
my business doesn't have enough
calibrate.
My business doesn't have enough funds to fight any of those companies. So
right. So we're kind of coming up, I think, on that like 40-minute, 50-minute mark now, which is perfect for this kind of topic.
I do want to talk about that recent report about watch fires.
I was going to ask too, because we were talking about, I was thinking, if it's at the point of demand where it's just easier to do movement costs and stuff out there, how has demand for new watches in the market like really shifted recently? Like, what sort of market trends for vintage and for modern? I think people would be interested to know. Like, I would imagine people assume that the market is growing for watches, because obviously there's bigger supply, so there has to be bigger demand, right? So what does that look like from the dealer side of things?
Well, this is a recent report from Watchfinders, which is one of the biggest pre-owned dealers in the world, and they surveyed, I think, like 2,600 Gen Zers, and they found that the biggest class of consumers for luxury watches is Gen Z.
Really?
Yeah, and their average spend is over $10,000.
Is this their customers or is this broad? Do we know that?
It should be broad, because they said 41% of Gen Z acquired a luxury watch.
I think the big thing for me on that, especially on the 11 grand side, what verification was used, because a lot of younger people, as we probably even know personally.
Well, the thing is, here's the insidious part.
Numbers,
a lot of Gen Zers are taking on debt to buy the watches.
So then it's just a status.
Yeah.
Then they're, then they just want it for the name.
Like they're selling things just so they can get. They might not have a nice place to live, a car to drive, but they have a nice watch.
So you think it's a status symbol?
Yeah.
It feels like the real estate bubble, where they're taking on debt to buy,
Yeah.
They have 5 houses and they make 40 grand a year.
That's what it feels like. So
you've got your Vacheron, but
please don't scam me like that.
Yeah, compared to like Gen X and millennials, we're spending about half, like five. That was our average spend, and we're buying way less watches. And of course, the top two brands is Rolex and Cartier.
Sure.
They're the most pushed brands on social media.
Yeah.
Cartier has done a good job with that, I have to say.
Yeah, Cartier is killing.
Yeah.
So that's some very interesting data.
It is really interesting, and so then you think of how Rolex has grown so much. Since the pandemic, nothing has been the same with Rolex or any of the, but even before that, and I guess if those numbers are accurate, then it's kind of like that's the market that Rolex is trying to crack out, are the people that are willing to just spend money even if they don't have it for Rolex.
Yeah.
Being something that you're not, is what you're telling me watches have become.
Yeah. It's straight from the
cringy,
the original path.
Sure.
And now it's more about status, and it's no more than like a Gucci belt, right? But it's just $10,000.
Get one on Canal Street for $20. So with that in mind, then maybe in closing we can end on some expert recommendations. If, let's say, and we'll use that example, okay, 11,000. If that's your top, you can buy multiple watches. You can buy one watch for a new watch buyer, and they're not going to go into debt to buy a Rolex or a Cartier. What would you recommend for a solid buy that's unique, whether it's vintage or modern, from a company with interesting history, the pedigree maybe, but good quality overall, a nice unique watch with good design, and that's your cap.
You want to start with vintage?
Since that's what they're buying.
You can start, so I want them to be shocked when they can buy one watch.
All right, I made some notes here. Let me see. So I guess there's 3 different price points, right?
Yeah, we could break it down. Say maybe for casual, buy like under 1,000, and then 5,000, and then the cap of 10K.
I think under 1,000. If you're gonna go pre-owned, modern pre-owned, go Nomos. Nomos or any Seikos with like a porcelain dial or enamel dial. That's where I think you're getting the most watchmaking for the money.
How do they hold value?
Terrible.
Terrible.
Well, that's why you buy a pre-owned.
Retail versus pre-owned. Like, how do they, on the pre-owned market, even with the market being slower?
50 cents on the dollar.
Are they holding though, pre-owned?
Yeah, once it gets down to a certain level, it kind of stays there.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think it's a sweet spot for under 1,000.
And Nomos is a really good value.
Fantastic, under $1,000. Under 5,000, pre-owned Grand Seiko. I mean, you can get a modern new spring drive high beats for like 3.5. It's the amount of watches you get for that. I think it's amazing. Omega Globemaster is one of my favorites.
Oh,
yeah, you don't hear about that a lot.
Yeah, you don't. Yeah.
Under 10, any pre-owned Blancpain. Especially, you can get a Bathyscaphe flyback chronograph in like silver or any metal you want for under $10,000.
What are those at retail?
Oh,
a little more than that.
I think they're like around 20 retail.
Oh, so 50 off.
Yeah, 50 off, and you're getting essentially it's the same movement you see in Royal Oak flyback chrono.
Sure,
you're getting $9,000 for that movement in a modern ceramic case. Fantastic. Any glossy original?
Yeah, you've got one here.
I've got one.
What do you like about it? What is it?
Just the level of finishing and details. Just the attention to details they have. It's you put this next to a sub, and it'll make the sub look like a toy. And the
movement. Open case back. Do you see?
It is. Yeah. I want to get your opinion on the movement.
I think they're high quality.
Yeah.
Look under the dial though. If we're going to be seeing what we're talking about. Yeah, high quality finish. Right. And even stripes on it.
Glossyto's, I think, such a strong value, especially when you get to like
and there's still
Panamatic Lunars or whatever.
Panamatic Lunars,
super
any CQs. And there you can still see human touch on the case back because they hand decorate the bridge.
So you got a miniature long end.
Yeah.
So that is hand finishing on here.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And this
humanity does exist.
This is actually from my shop. I think it's going for like 9,000 for 2-tone.
Great value.
They retail for like 16.
Yeah.
I think it's a great value under 10
quality.
for a modern watch.
When I'm looking at like the balance bridge and the finishing on the regulator spring, yeah, it's comparable with high-end vintage. So
wow, guys,
there you go. You got the stamp.
I'm happy.
Those would be stamp of approval.
how many do they make a year?
Not a lot.
No,
Exactly.
So what about you?
Let's go back to that again.
So what about you? 1,000, 5, and 10.
1,000, 5, and 10. I mean, around 1,000 and even below 1,000, you can get a super great condition vintage Seamaster. That's kind of an, I don't know, it's kind of a basic answer in my opinion, but
just state it.
yeah, it's just a great watch, great brand, and I mean, awesome delivery in terms of waterproofing. You can get a lot of them with one-piece cases, so at least it may not die, but it'll be waterproof. So,
you can like wash your hands, walk in the rain.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and you can get something also around that $1,000 range that super rare, even in a sense. Like we have the Bulletwood President here with like Mirado. That's below 1,000. New old stock. I mean, yeah, getting something at that price point is really achievable in vintage. That's why it's almost hard for me to even jump to the next price point other than like mentioning something basic again, like a vintage Speedmaster. It's kind of the same kind of thing. You want to buy a modern one for $5K. You want to buy a vintage one that's actually limited, actually has some history behind it, and it has character to it. The loom changes. If the watch has stayed original, it has all its original character to it. You don't have to worry about a movement swap. Yeah, and then even better, the band, if it stays original, adds a lot of character to it also. And I think especially the vintage Speedy bands are super high quality. They're such great watch bands. A lot of people skip that aspect, I think. You can also get something in the $5,000 range that's super limited production, like truly scarce. Hundreds, for example. If we want to get real crazy, you can switch into pocket watches, and you can buy pocket watches under 100 pieces made, below 5K. So if you're talking from a modern perspective, one of the big brands producing something under 100, what normally is the price point looking at? I'm actually curious. Do you know of a brand that produced like something under 100?
What under 100? I don't know.
I mean, Grand Seiko do some very limited releases.
And what are their prices?
Yeah, that's crazy.
It depends. Like steel, you're looking at 10 grand. Gold, like 30.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So when they drop below 100, it's just like a crazy. You can pick up a super high quality antique pocket watch for $3K. I mean, that nobody else is gonna have.
Yeah, but the market for a pocket watch is way smaller.
For like that's
I'm
the
just
thing.
talking about it. It pushes at that price point. I'm going back to high horology, like really high quality finish. At the time, innovative production. Yeah.
But let's say if you want to persuade like the Gen Zers on the report to kind of like veer off the Rolexes,
Pocket watches. No.
like something easy they can get into and it's not too difficult. What would you recommend?
Vintage Speedy, yeah.
Vintage Speedy.
Yeah. Super basic with that, and then I mean, I guess the $10,000 range, we're talking about stuff that's super scarce, and you could buy something with some really interesting aspects. I go to my own wrist for that. This is a Google and Jubilee. You won't see them. There's 200 total runs of 10, so this is one of 10. Can't even fathom what a modern brand putting that out would look like. It's probably $50,000 watch. It's 8 to 10K. So finding one is the problem. That's
the thing with
vintage. Gonna appear.
Yeah, you have to really put in some effort. Going to the forums, eBay.
I think it adds that human aspect because you actually have to hunt.
You gotta work for it.
It's not just read. You have to read the history of what you're looking for, and then if this style variant was legitimate for 1965, or if it might be faked or refinished or whatever. And it is. I mean, if anything's going to separate a modern buyer from a vintage buyer, that's what it's going to be. I mean, it's very easy with modern to go, oh, I like the way that looks. The money's right. It looks really cool. Makes me feel good. Swipe the credit card.
Yeah.
Vintage. you have so much more work done ahead of time. If
Yeah.
you're really informed. I mean, a lot of people will buy more affordable vintage pieces on the same kind of whim that you might an affordable modern piece,
Yeah.
just because they like the look. But if you're really in the thick of it, it takes way more research and reading than
Yeah,
others.
it does.
Yeah. Well, guys, I think we covered a lot of ground and we touched very lightly on some topics. I think we're definitely going to have to do a part 2, maybe a part 3 at some point, and really, get into the weeds of some very specific kind of stuff.
Are we on Plano for part 2?
Yeah, you can come to my
Plano
store.
part 2. Let's
Yeah.
go.
Plano part 2. I like it. I like it. Well, guys, thanks so much for your time, and we'll.
It was fun.
Yeah, man.
Yeah.
Get this up and
Thank you.
ready to go, and stay tuned for part 2.
Thank you.